It's interesting when you look around this podium here to see that there isn't a state that's not impacted by disaster. And, you can have a state as large as Florida, as large as New Jersey, rural like North Dakota and like Louisiana. And we all know that it is some of the most trying times for so many of our people. And certainly when we think about disaster in North Dakota, we think about flooding, and it's not the kind of gush flooding that you see come down a valley. It's the slow rising of water that spreads out of the banks and literally can destroy a whole town, similar to what happened in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Now being a kind of veteran of the programs, obviously we were participating and glad to see the chairman's emphasis and on the RISE Act, see it passing, but also want to make sure that implementation is done in a way that we think that was intended by Congress. And one of the criticisms that I frequently hear, especially of the SBA programs, is the criticism that it seems like there's one hand taking or one hand extended while the other hand's taking, and way too often for small businesses, it's not just their business that is affected, there also is their home. And so we were pretty insistent that a provision needed to be placed that would prohibit SBA from collateralizing someone's home, because then literally their whole life is at risk unless that was necessary. Mr. Kramer, can you tell me what's the timeline in implementation of that provision? Because as I understand it, it's one of the provisions of the RISE Act that hasn't yet received a implementation, has not been implemented. And if it's not been implemented, then what is your time frame in which you will see it being implemented?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. And I think you hit in the question on some of the challenges that we face in providing disaster assistance and running a prudently managed program. That on the one hand, we go into these difficult circumstances. We are the loan side of the operation, not the grant side of the operation. So in addition to providing support, we're creating a long-term relationship. Under existing laws and regulations, we're required to take the best available collateral in order to protect the long-term sustainability and integrity of the program. But I think when you talk to all of our folks who work in the Office of Disaster Assistance, they know well how to be both competent and also compassionate of the circumstances that people are going through. So as I think we are looking right now at writing regulations that enforce the specific language of the RISE Act with regard to taking collateralization of the home. And I expect that at some point this summer we will have a draft of that, because we are trying right now to figure out how to do exactly what you just said, to be compassionate and understanding about people's need to keep their home after a disaster, but also to do in a way that also serves the other obligations that we have to take collateral in these loan programs, maintain the subsidy rate that we operate with, and all of that. So I can tell you that all of those aspects of your question are being given due consideration. We're in the process of working on a regulation this year that I think we will have in draft form by sometime this summer.
So you anticipate that by this summer we'll at least know what the draft regulation looks like, with implementation probably by the end of the year?
I think that's probably the schedule for that.
What would you do in the meantime? The old rules would remain in existence until you change, or would there be an ad hoc determination? Let's say we had a disaster tomorrow in North Dakota,
right,
with SBA funding for small business. How would given that this law is in effect, how would you then implement this provision without a regulation?
I asked our staff a very similar question to that what we're doing in the interim, and how often it is the case that we go in and actually take and try to foreclose on the property of a disaster survivor. And my understanding is, because of what we do and the other resources we have in the field, actually foreclosing on someone's home as collateral is an act of absolute last resort that we don't see happen very often. And so I've made clear to that staff that before we take some action, we would need to think clearly about how to make sure that we're in compliance with the new terms of the statute. But it's something, frankly, that I don't think we expect to happen in the short term while we're doing this.
Well, obviously, I'm deeply concerned, because a lot of times second and third mortgages on homes is a reality for homes that are devastated by natural disaster, and simply to you know, if you're a homeowner, one would question why you would ever hang on, and that's not good for the community either. So if we're going to see communities recover, we need to make sure that there's a possibility of recovery in a way that is maybe more humane than what we've had before. Ms. Zimmerman, I think we've come a long way on disaster response and recovery, and certainly with the passage of the RISE Act. But there's always room for improvement, and I know that when we look at the challenges in a rural state like North Dakota, getting out there and getting people to kind of appreciate what the unique challenges are in a rural community. Can you just tell me what you see as necessary next steps to provide coverage, not just in large urban areas, but also rural areas in terms of recovery from natural disaster?
As we're out in any disaster, it is challenging when you're in a rural community that's been impacted by disasters to make sure we go to the people. And that's one of the things that we, over the last few years, have been concentrating on with FEMA, to make sure we have staff going out in the field to meet the disaster survivors where they're at, where they're trying to recover, and not making them come to us. So by having mobile centers that we move around and take people so that they can be walking the streets in those rural communities or driving to where the people live to make sure they're getting the assistance, whether it be that is assistance that FEMA could provide, or for many of the voluntary agencies, and we're working very closely with other partners that we have in the emergency management disaster response world.
I think one of the great challenges here in terms of disaster relief is the balance between wanting it to be self-contained and have no subsidization from federal taxpayer dollars, and then recognizing that the taxpayer input and dollars that we can bring to help a community recover is good overall for the economy of this country, but also is a good investment. And so it's a tough balance. And so you see it right now with flood insurance. I'm trying to figure out if we're going to cash flow flood insurance entirely on its own, or whether we're going to have some kind of subsidization that recognizes a universal risk that we all take and that we're all in it together. And so I think these are issues that we're going to have to work through in Congress. But we certainly appreciate the work that both of you do, and I'm grateful, as is my state, for all of the assistance FEMA has given us as we experience, whether it's a tornado or whether it's devastating flooding in my state. Thank you again for your public service.